I never thought I'd become a single mom. But as I sat in my small apartment, the glow of my laptop casting light on a pile of overdue bills, I realized my life had never gone according to plan. While my younger sister, Olivia, was busy picking wedding flowers and trying on dazzling white dresses, I was here, crunching numbers to make sure I had enough money to pay for my son's tuition. Ironically, my mother, Margaret, proudly bragged about Olivia's lavish wedding but looked down on me like I was some kind of failure. "Hannah, you're always busy with those stupid numbers. Life isn't just about work, you know that, right?" My mom's voice crackled through the phone, bitter and judgmental. I glanced at the clock on my laptop. It was nearly 6 p.m. I had 30 minutes before I had to pick up Ben, my 8-year-old son, from school. "I have to work, Mom. Not everyone has a rich man taking care of everything like Olivia does." I heard her sigh in frustration. "There you go again. You're always jealous of your sister. She has love because she deserves it. If you keep living like this, no one will ever want you." I clenched my jaw. No one would ever want me? I had been in love. I had trusted someone. And then, I was left with a child in my arms, while the man I loved vanished, chasing a life that didn't include me. But I didn't have time to cry or dwell on it. I had a child to raise, a job to keep, and a life to build on my own. "So you called just to remind me how useless I am?" I asked, my tone calm but laced with bitterness. "No. I called to talk about dinner tomorrow. Olivia wants the whole family there. She's introducing her fiancé. You have to come." I let out a dry laugh. "Oh, another evening for you and Olivia to show off how perfect she is and highlight what a failure I am. Sounds delightful. Think whatever you want. But you need to be there. And make sure Ben doesn't cause trouble. You know how Olivia hates noise. Ben is a good kid. If anyone causes trouble, it's not him." My mom didn't even bother to respond, just the cold sound of the call ending. I set my phone down on the table and took a deep breath to stay calm. I was used to being pushed aside, to the criticism from my mother and Olivia's indifference. But for Ben, I couldn't fall apart. I had to keep moving forward, no matter how rough the road got. The dinner my mom mentioned came sooner than I expected. I stood in front of the grand gate of the luxurious mansion that my mom and Olivia always loved to brag about. The large windows glowed warmly, but I knew that inside wasn't a place meant for me. Beside me, Ben squeezed my hand gently. "Mom, do we really have to go in?" His voice was small but filled with worry. I knelt down and brushed his brown hair. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. If you're uncomfortable, we'll leave early." The door opened before I could even knock. My mom stood there in an elegant dress, a polite smile on her lips but ice in her eyes. "Hannah, you finally made it. Come in, but remember, don't embarrass Olivia." I gave a half smile. Same old words. Walking into the spacious living room, I could already hear Olivia's bright laughter. She was lounging comfortably on a chair, a striking red dress hugging her perfect figure, a wineglass in hand. She looked every bit the center of attention. "Hannah, you're here!" Olivia exclaimed, but the way she looked at me was like she was sizing up an outdated outfit. "And this must be Ben, right? Oh my gosh, he's grown so fast." "Hi, Aunt Olivia," Ben said softly, stepping closer to me. Olivia didn't respond to him. She had already turned away, chatting with other guests. I bit my lip to hold back the wave of anger rising in my chest. To her, Ben was just another unwanted detail in the perfect painting she was trying to create of her life. "Oh, Hannah, come here for a sec." Olivia waved me over, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I want to introduce you to my fiancé, Jackson Carter." I turned and for a moment, time stopped. Jackson stood there, tall, with dark hair and deep eyes. He had the look of a man who had seen life, polished but not distant. When our eyes met, I felt a strange sense of familiarity. "Nice to meet you, Hannah." His voice was warm and smooth. I shook his hand, and as soon as our hands touched, a faint memory stirred in my mind, but I couldn't quite place it. "Nice to meet you too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Jackson looked down at Ben and smiled. "And this must be your son?" Ben nodded, a little shy. Yes, I'm Ben. How old are you? 8. Awesome. When I was 8, I spent the whole summer building a wooden fort. Do you like building things? Ben hesitated, then his eyes lit up. I like assembling models. I just finished a Lego spaceship last week. Jackson laughed. Really? Then you'll have to show it to me someday. Throughout the conversation, I noticed Olivia standing nearby, arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly in irritation. Jackson, sweetheart, can you pour me another glass of wine? Olivia interrupted, cutting off his conversation with Ben. Jackson nodded. But before walking away, he glanced at me once more, a thoughtful look in his eyes. The evening went on, with long conversations about the wedding, the extravagant plans Olivia proudly flaunted. I stayed quiet the whole time, focusing only on Ben and the meal in front of me. But inside, the questions kept spinning. Why did Jackson look so familiar? And why did his eyes seem to be trying to tell me something he couldn't say out loud? Something was coming, I could feel it. I never thought I'd have any role in Olivia's wedding, but when I received the message from my mom, a small pang still hit me. You're not on the bridesmaids list, hope you understand. You're busy with Ben and work, right? Reading Olivia's message, I gave a dry smile. Of course, I wasn't surprised. She didn't want a sister who looked so plain standing among her glamorous bridesmaids. I didn't fit into her glittering world. The world where everything had to be dazzling, perfect, and with no place for single moms like me. I put the phone down and turned back to the stack of papers on my desk. No matter how grand Olivia's wedding would be, it couldn't matter more than making sure everything was right for Ben. But then, when my mother called again the next morning, I knew I wouldn't completely escape this. Hannah, can you help me with something? Margaret's voice was unnaturally sweet, like she was about to ask for something I couldn't say no to. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. What is it? The wedding needs someone to handle the guest list paperwork. Olivia's too busy with dress fittings and photo shoots. I thought you could help. Help? Weren't they the ones who pushed me aside? But instead of pushing back, I bit my lip and stayed calm. If I refused, Mom would just say I was being petty, that I always make myself the victim. I'll do it, I replied flatly. I spent the next week managing the guest list, checking the venue, and following up with the event company, things Olivia should have been doing, but she was too busy showing off her wedding of the century on Instagram. When I arrived at my mother's mansion one afternoon to go over the seating chart, Jackson was standing at the kitchen counter, holding a cup of coffee, his eyes watching me. Hannah, helping Olivia again? He asked, his voice low, with a hint of something probing. I shrugged, flipping through the guest list. Seems like it. Even though I'm not considered part of the wedding, apparently I'm still useful when needed. Jackson set his cup down and leaned on the counter, his eyes thoughtful. Olivia shouldn't treat you that way. I gave a sarcastic smile. You're just realizing that now? Jackson didn't respond right away. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to find something in my eyes. From the first time I met you, I felt like I knew you. His voice dropped. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. What do you mean? He looked like he was about to say something else, but at that moment, Olivia walked in, trailing a strong cloud of perfume. Jackson, darling, I need your help picking the flower arrangements. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were sharp as she looked at me. Jackson hesitated for a second before nodding and following Olivia out. I watched them go, a strange feeling rising in my chest. The following days, I kept working behind the scenes of the extravagant wedding. No one asked for my input on the menu, the speeches, or anything important. But every time Jackson appeared, he gave me those strange looks, like he was trying to remember something. Then one evening, while I was sitting in my mother's living room editing the guest list, Jackson suddenly walked in. Do you remember me? He asked, his voice serious. I looked up, frowning. Have we met before? Jackson let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't a joyful one. 10 years ago. At St. Mary's Hospital. I froze. That name hit me like a cold wind rushing through my memories. St. Mary's. The hospital where I once volunteered as a young woman. Where I had spent months caring for patients fighting for their lives. And then, the image of a young girl with light blonde hair, a pale face that always carried a smile, appeared in my mind. "Your sister," I whispered, a chill running down my spine. Jackson nodded, his eyes lighting up like he had just found a missing piece of a puzzle. "I've been looking for you all these years, Hannah." I looked at Jackson, my heart pounding as the faded memories began to take shape. St. Mary's Hospital. That name wasn't distant at all. I had spent months there as a volunteer, caring for patients I knew might not make it. And then, there was that girl with the gentle smile, the light blonde hair, and the hopeful blue eyes. "Your sister was Claire," I whispered, barely believing my own memory. Jackson nodded, his gaze sharp but filled with pain. "You remember now?" I swallowed hard, a heavy feeling tightening in my chest. I took care of her. I didn't know you were Claire's brother." Jackson quietly pulled out a chair and sat across from me. He looked at me, as if trying to confirm that the woman in front of him was the one he had been searching for all these years. "I didn't recognize you right away," he said, his voice low, "but when I saw you, something kept tugging at me, like a piece of something important I had forgotten. Today, I finally remembered." I stayed silent as the pieces slowly fell into place in my mind. Claire had been such a strong girl, even as cancer drained her strength, she kept smiling. I remembered the late nights sitting by her bedside, reading her favorite books, sharing stories about life. And I remembered a young man who visited her every weekend. A boy with deep, worried eyes, and a tense face whenever the doctors delivered more bad news. It was Jackson. I clenched my hands, my voice hoarse. "You used to come to the hospital every Saturday. You always brought sunflowers." Jackson gave a faint smile, though his eyes held a deep sadness. "Yeah. Sunflowers were her favorite." Suddenly, another image flashed in my mind. A little boy holding a messy drawing, running into Claire's hospital room. Back then my son was only 5. I used to bring him to the hospital with me when I worked weekend shifts. Ben, with his innocent heart, had made so many drawings for the patients. Claire included. I still remembered the way Claire's eyes sparkled with joy when she received one of his pictures. A bright sun next to a smiling girl with blonde hair. Jackson blinked, as if the memory returned to him too. "I still have that drawing." I looked at him, stunned. "When Claire passed, I put it in a memory box. Today, when I remembered who you were, I went home and opened it." Jackson's voice tightened. "And you know what? Among Claire's things, there's still a letter she wrote to you, but never got the chance to send." I felt everything around me blur. "A letter? Claire wanted to say something to me before she passed?" Jackson pulled a small time-worn envelope from his pocket. I stared at it, my hands trembling as I reached for it. "Hannah," Jackson said, his voice low and full of emotion. "We have a past you don't know about. I've been looking for you for years, but I never imagined fate would bring us back together. Like this." I opened the envelope, my eyes scanning Claire's messy, yet heartfelt handwriting. "Hannah, if you're reading this letter, I'm probably no longer here. But I want you to know, in the final days of my life, you gave me something no doctor ever could. Warmth and hope. You were the light in my darkest days. Thank you. And if someday you meet my little brother again, tell him I always loved him, and I hope he finds true happiness." I hadn't even realized when the tears began rolling down my cheeks. Jackson gently took my hand, his eyes full of emotion. "I owe you more than I could ever say," he whispered. "And now I know one thing for sure. I can't let you disappear from my life again." I looked up at Jackson, my heart tangled in 100 different emotions. I had just reconnected with someone I never knew I shared such a deep bond with. A door to the past had opened, dragging along memories and feelings I never thought I'd face again. And I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. I never looked forward to this day, but like it or not, Olivia's wedding happened, and I had to be there. Walking into the grand reception hall, I held Ben's hand tightly, reminding myself it was just one night. Just stay quiet, play my part, and I could leave. But the moment I stepped in, my mother's cold eyes scanned over me, sharp and judgmental. "Hannah, you finally made it," Margaret said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Just don't do anything that might embarrass Olivia." I gave a faint smile. "No worries, Mom, I'm not the center of attention tonight." The party buzzed with laughter and chatter. Olivia dazzled in her intricate wedding gown, clinging to Jackson like she owned the world. Everyone cheered and admired them, but I sat quietly in the corner, next to Ben. I could handle being ignored. I was used to it. But then came the truly horrifying moment. Olivia stood up, microphone in hand, her face glowing with a forced radiance. "Before we continue with the reception," she said, smiling that perfect smile, her eyes like knives when they turned to me, "I'd like to say a few words about my family. This is my sister Hannah. A strong, independent woman?" She paused, then chuckled. "And a very proud single mother." Soft laughter rippled from some of the guests. I could feel Ben's eyes locked on me, his little face filled with fear. Olivia went on, her voice sugary, but every word a sharp blade. "She's always so busy with work, with life, still hasn't found anyone who can actually put up with her long term. But hey, that's okay, right? There's always room in the world for the slightly used." The hall went silent. A few nervous chuckles echoed, but most guests were stunned by Olivia's cruelty. I gripped Ben's hand tightly. But before I could react, my mother, Margaret, jumped in, as if to finish off what was left of my dignity. "She's right, Hannah's always been a little too serious," my mother said, shaking her head and raising her wineglass with a fake smile. "She may be a bit used, but still functional, as long as she's not too damaged." Laughter erupted from one corner of the room. I could feel Ben trembling beside me. I looked down, his eyes were glassy with tears. I couldn't let him stay in this room 1 second longer. I stood up and pulled Ben with me, but just as I turned to leave, a deep voice cut through the awful silence. "It's enough. Jackson." He placed his wineglass firmly on the table and stood up. The entire room fell still. Those words, "Do you think that was a joke?" Jackson's voice was calm, but laced with anger. "What gives you the right to humiliate Hannah like that?" Olivia's eyes widened, confusion and fury flashing across her face. "Jackson, what are you doing? This is our wedding day. And you think that gives you the right to mock your own sister in front of hundreds of people?" Jackson stared at Olivia, his voice sharp as a blade. My mother spoke up, her tone laced with irritation. "Jackson, you don't understand. Hannah is always—" "I understand perfectly," Jackson cut in, his eyes darkening. "I've been looking for her for years, never knowing she was my future sister-in-law. And today on my own wedding day, I watched her be humiliated by her own family, for no reason." The room grew so tense that no one dared to speak. Jackson looked directly at me, his eyes filled with determination. "Hannah," he said slowly, "come with me." I stared at him, unsure of what was happening. "We don't need to stay here," Jackson continued, his voice firm. "You don't deserve to be treated like this, and neither does Ben." I looked at Jackson, then around the room full of stunned faces. Olivia looked like she was about to explode, and my mother seemed unable to comprehend what was unfolding. I turned to Ben and saw him nod, his eyes full of hope. Taking a deep breath, I placed my hand in Jackson's. "All right," I said, "let's go." As we walked out of the reception hall, leaving behind a sea of whispers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. And I knew, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't think Jackson would actually do it. I thought he was just standing up for me, and then he'd go back to Olivia pretending nothing had happened. But the moment we stepped outside the hall, I heard his voice ring out. Strong and clear, like thunder in the middle of a storm. "Wait!" I froze. Olivia turned sharply, eyes wide with confusion. Jackson stood in the center of the grand but hollow room, his expression serious. He was no longer the perfect groom Olivia had envisioned, but a man holding up the truth for everyone to see. "I can't go through with this wedding." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Olivia's eyes widened, her voice cracking with desperation. "Jackson, what are you saying? This is our wedding day." Jackson shook his head, his eyes cold and detached. "No, Olivia, this isn't our day, this is a performance. You and your mother's attempt to publicly shame the one person you should be honoring, your sister." Olivia rushed toward him, gripping his arm as if trying to pull him back into the version of reality she still believed in. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone, you can't do this." Jackson looked down at her hand wrapped around his wrist, then calmly removed it. "I'm not humiliating you, Olivia, you did that all on your own." He turned to the stunned guests, their eyes bouncing between confusion and shock. "Do any of you even know who Hannah is, or more importantly, what she's done?" I held my breath. 10 years ago, when my sister Claire was in the final stage of cancer, it was Hannah who stayed by her side every day. When I was too broken and helpless to do anything, it was Hannah who gave Claire strength. She made my sister's last days full of hope. A gasp sounded from somewhere in the room. Some guests fell silent, clearly unaware of any of this. Jackson continued, his voice lower but steady. "And the woman I was about to marry, Olivia, along with her mother, could stand here on this day, at this wedding, and humiliate the very woman who brought light to my sister's darkest days. They didn't just insult Hannah, they insulted her innocent child as well." My mother, Margaret, immediately stood up, her voice icy. "Jackson, she's manipulating you. Don't let a minor past ruin your marriage." Jackson let out a dry laugh. "A minor past? A woman who gave her time, her heart, her energy for someone else? And this is how you repay her?" I felt my entire body tremble. I'd grown used to being dismissed by my family, but no one had ever spoken up for me like this before. Jackson turned back to Olivia, his face full of disappointment. "I used to think you had a warm heart," Jackson said, staring straight at Olivia, his voice as sharp as a knife. "That you were just influenced by your mother's standards. But today, I realize I was wrong. You're not just shallow. You're cruel." Olivia's face went pale, her lips trembling. "Jackson, you can't do this to me." He looked at her for a long moment, then silently removed the wedding ring from his finger. "My mind is made up, this marriage ends right here." The air in the room turned to ice. The whispers faded into a suffocating silence. Olivia screamed and lunged toward Jackson. "You can't leave me, what about my reputation?" Jackson stepped back without hesitation. "You lost your dignity the moment you mocked your own sister." I saw my mother freeze, rage flashing in her eyes. She rushed forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Jackson, at least let's talk this through." But Jackson had already turned away. He walked straight toward me and Ben, extending his hand. "Come on, Hannah. We don't need to stay here." I looked at his hand, then at Ben. My son nodded, his eyes glowing with hope. Without another moment of doubt, I took Jackson's hand. The three of us walked out of the reception hall, leaving behind Olivia's shrieks, my mother's furious voice, the hushed whispers of the guests, and a room that had descended into chaos. As we stepped outside, I looked up at the clear night sky, breathing in the crisp, cool air. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in years, I truly felt free. 1 year later, I stood in front of the glass doors of my new office, staring at the polished sign that read, HJ Financial Services. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the lettering. This wasn't just a company. It was the result of countless efforts, tears, and difficult decisions. I once thought my life would always be trapped under my mother's and Olivia's judgment, that I'd forever be the forgotten sister on the sidelines. But not anymore. I was no one's shadow now. "Mom, I'm done." Ben's voice pulled me back to the present. I turned to see my son standing at the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, a proud smile on his face. He'd grown taller, his face brighter. This past year had changed both of us. Are you sure this is your company? It looks so fancy, Ben said, wide-eyed, stepping inside and looking around in awe. I laughed. I'm sure, sweetheart. He nodded thoughtfully, then shrugged. Makes sense. You're the best, after all. That innocent compliment warmed me more than anything else could. I knelt down, straightening his collar, gazing into his bright, confident eyes. You're the best too, and I'm so proud of you. Ben grinned, but before he could say anything else, the office door opened. Jackson. He walked in holding a paper bag and 2 cups of hot coffee. Setting them on the desk, he handed one to me. Congratulations on your grand opening. I accepted the cup, feeling the warmth spread through my fingers. Thank you, Jackson. If it weren't for you, I might never have had the courage to do this. He shook his head, his gaze gentle. Hannah. You've always had it in you. You just needed to believe it yourself. I smiled, thinking back over everything that had happened in the past year. After that disastrous wedding, I cut ties completely with my mother and Olivia. At first they kept trying to reach out, especially my mom, but when I stopped giving in, she realized I'd truly stepped out of the path she had planned for me. As for Olivia, no one talked about her anymore. After the humiliating broken engagement, her reputation crumbled. Those who once flattered her distanced themselves. Her wealthy friends vanished, and she was forced to face life without anyone to lean on. My mother ended up in a similar position. Without flashy connections and financial support, she had to learn how to fend for herself. I heard she sold the mansion and moved into a small apartment. But I didn't care. I had chosen a different path. I left my old job and, with Jackson's support, started my own accounting firm. From a tiny office, I gradually built a reputation, and within just a few months, my business grew faster than I could have imagined. Jackson and I also grew closer. He didn't rush me, didn't pressure me to define our relationship right away. We took our time, learning each other, building something stronger than anything I'd ever had before. So, are we celebrating tonight? Jackson asked, bringing me back to the moment. I looked at him, then at Ben, and saw my son's eyes light up with excitement. Of course, but Ben gets to pick the place. Ben jumped up. Then pizza! And ice cream too! Jackson laughed, giving Ben a light pat on the back. I like your taste, kid. I stood there, watching the two of them chat happily, and suddenly felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I used to think my life was just a series of tragedies and losses, but now, I knew I had found another path. A path where I could take charge of my own life, where Ben could grow up surrounded by real love, and where, for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I walked over and wrapped my arm around my son's shoulders. Let's go. We've got a night to enjoy. The 3 of us left the office together, stepping out into the wide, open world. A new world, filled with new beginnings. This Christmas was nothing like the ones before. I stood by the living room window, watching the first snowflakes of the season fall gently, blanketing the rooftops in white. The air was so still I could hear the soft crackling of firewood in the fireplace, and Ben's joyful laughter from the kitchen, where he was helping Jackson decorate gingerbread cookies. For the first time in many years, I felt truly at peace. The Christmas tree in the corner glowed with lights, neatly wrapped gifts placed underneath. No more lavish parties where I had to fake a smile. No more insults or cold stares from people who once called themselves my family. Just me, my son, and a man who had walked into my life unexpectedly and stayed with his whole heart. Hannah, can you come out here for a second? I turned around and saw Jackson standing in the center of the living room, his eyes softer than ever. Ben stood next to him, flashing a mischievous grin. Mom, hurry up! There was something in the way they looked at me that made my heart race. I stepped forward, feeling the cold air sneak through the window cracks. But inside, I was warm. Jackson took a deep breath and slowly pulled out a small velvet box. I froze. He opened it, revealing a ring with a sparkling emerald stone. I recognized it immediately. That's Claire's ring, I said, my voice shaking. Jackson nodded, his deep blue eyes filled with emotion. She once told me that when I met someone truly special, I should give her this ring. He paused for a moment, then continued, his voice steady but full of feeling. Hannah, you changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You were there for Claire in her final days. And now? You're here for me and Ben, making our lives better every single day. Ben tugged on my sleeve, his voice eager. Mom. Say yes. I looked down and saw my son beaming, his eyes shining with joy. Happiness. Such a simple word, but one that had felt so far away for so long. I took a deep breath and looked into Jackson's sincere eyes. Are you sure? I asked, my voice trembling. Are you ready for this? A not-so-perfect family, a child who's not yours? Jackson squeezed my hand tightly. Family isn't about blood, Hannah. It's about the people who stay, who protect each other, and who love without conditions. Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, unable to find the words. So that means she said yes, right? Ben shouted, jumping up and down. Jackson smiled and gently slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. I took a shaky breath and laughed as Ben danced around us like a little squirrel. This is the best Christmas ever. Jackson pulled me into his arms and whispered, Welcome to a real family, Hannah. I closed my eyes, sinking into his warm embrace. Outside, the snow kept falling, quietly, gently, marking the beginning of something new. A journey no longer taken alone, a life full of hope waiting ahead. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had found where I truly belonged. Hannah's story is not just a journey of breaking free from her family's control and disrespect, it's a testament to the power of self-worth and resilience. In life, we can't choose where we come from, but we can choose how we live, how we love, and how we protect our own values. Happiness doesn't come from being validated by others, it comes from recognizing our own worth. A real family isn't built solely on blood, but on respect, support, and unconditional love. What do you think about Hannah's journey? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own family, or witnessed someone fight to reclaim their self-worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more inspiring stories to come.